Hello, NUR 410. Welcome back for week 2. I hope you all have enjoyed your week 1 activities and knowledge sharing in nursing research, reading, using, and creating evidence. So in week 2, we're going to look at two main chapters. Ethical and legal considerations in research and carrying out a successful literature review. So in this lecture, we will look at ethics and legal issues in research. And for your reading assignment, you can review chapter 5 in your course books, which covers the other topics. A little introduction. So ethics is the study of wrong and right. It explores what one might do when confronted with a situation where values, rights, personal beliefs, or societal norms may be in conflict. In everyday life, we are often faced with ethical situations when we must ask the question, what is the right thing to do in this particular situation? A type of philosophy that studies right and wrong. That's what ethics is all about. So ethical consideration tells us how we should conduct research. These directives for ethical conduct of nursing research are guided by the researcher's integrity and applied through personal decision making. Legal guidelines, in contrast, tell us how we are required to conduct the research. These guidelines are found in laws and regulations that are provided by agencies external to the nurse researcher. The two regulations provides guidance to the nurse researcher, and they are equally important for quality research. Researchers face ethical and legal situations in almost every step of the research process, from selecting participants to collecting data to reporting findings at the conclusion of the study. This chapter explores the history of ethical issues in research practice, the development of ethical guidelines for researchers, the elements of an ethical study, and the laws and regulations to consider when conducting research. Learning from the past and protecting the future. When humans participate as subjects in research studies, care must be taken to preserve their rights, their right to be informed of the study process and potential risks, their rights to be treated in a fair and transparent manner, and their right to withdraw from the study at any time for any reason without question or negative consequences. It comes from Franklin, Rowland, Fox, and Nicholson of 2012. Unfortunately, breaches of ethical conduct have a long history. In the aftermath of World War II, disclosure of Nazi experimentation on prison camp detainees revealed the need for consideration of basic human rights in research involving human subjects. In the United States, the revelation of the deception and non-treatment of men of color with syphilis during the Tuskegee syphilis study, 1932 to 1972, and more recently, the Gelsinger case at the University of Pennsylvania and the Rock case at the Johns Hopkins Asthma and Allergy Center, discussed later in this chapter. So demonstrate that ethical breaches are not solely of historical interest. Research that involves human subjects always requires careful consideration of the rights of those subjects. Although the primary investigators of these research activities were physicians, Evidence suggests that nurses were aware of the deceit in recruitment and delivery of non-therapeutic treatment, at least the Tuskegee syphilis study. Why are these events historically important to nurses? Reflection and careful thought about the roles of nurses in research, from data collector to principal investigator, and the responsibility nurses have to humankind mandate that we learn from the past, and doing so, protect the future. Ethical issues, a historical overview. The ethics of human subjects research and federal control have evolved since the mid-20th century. Professional organizations and international associations alike have developed codes of ethics that apply to research involving human subjects. In this chapter, the ethical foundation of research is examined, considering both research and remote examples of scientific transgressions that helped from current research practices. What society has legislatively imposed in context of research regulations is discussed well. Nazi medical experimentation. So from 1933 until 1945, and the liberation of the death camps in Europe, atrocities were inflicted on World War II concentration camp detainees in the name of science. As a part of the goal of advancing the Third Reich in Europe, the Nazis conducted medical experiments to produce a race of pure Aryans who would rule the world. Under the guise of benefiting soldiers of the Third Reich, Nazi physicians carried out experiments to test the limits of human endurance. For example, prisoners were submerged for days at a time in a tank of cold water. The intent was to test how long German pilots who had to parachute into the cold North Sea would survive. Different types of clothing were tested, as well as different methods for resuscitating the experimental subjects who survived. Other prisoners were burned with phosphorus to track wound healing. Surgery was performed without anesthesia to gauge pain levels. In utero surgery was carried out to determine fetal growth and development during stages of pregnancy, and surgical gender changes were accomplished. Many of the subjects of these experiments did not survive. These experiments were not randomly carried out by only a few scientists. Instead, they were regarded as fulfillment of governmental policy and support of the war effort. These atrocities in the name of scientific experimentation made it clear that international oversight of the rights of human subjects in research was necessary. The Tuskegee study. It is tempting to consider the Nazi studies to be examples of outrageous acts that could not occur in our own society. But unfortunately, the U.S. Public Health Service has its own record of outrageous treatment of experimental subjects. A study undertaken in 1932 by the Public Health Service set out to determine the natural history of syphilis, called the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. The study initially involved 600 black men, 399 with syphilis and 201 without. The study was conducted without obtaining the informed consent of the subjects. While the subjects were led to believe they were being treated for a blood disorder, in reality, the progress of their syphilis was allowed to unfold without treatment. Although originally projected to last 6 months, the study went on for 40 years. In 1972, a news story about the study caused a public outcry that that led to the government to appoint an ad hoc advisory panel to investigate the study. The panel concluded that the Tuskegee study was ethically unjustified and ordered reparations for the men and their families. International guides for the researcher. 2 major international codes and reports guide researchers in carrying out ethical research. The Nuremberg Code and the Declaration of Helsinki. The Nuremberg war crime trials, which were held from 1945 to 1947, focused on crimes against humanity. They were presided over by judges from the 4 Allied powers: the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. The city of Nuremberg, Germany, was proposedly chosen as the site for the trials because after 11 Allied airstrikes during the war, the city was declared 90% dead. During the trials, a large-scale prosecution of Nazi officials took place, many of whom presented as a defense the notion that they were simply following their superiors' orders. Their crimes included inhumane act on civilians, initiating and waging aggressive acts of war, murder, near extermination of race, slavery, ill treatment of prisoners, plunder, and destruction. In response to the revelations in these trials, the Nuremberg Code was developed in 1949. This code contained guidelines requiring voluntary, informed consent to participate in medical experimentation. It further specified that the research must serve a worthy purpose and the desired knowledge must be unobtainable by other means, and that the anticipated result justified the performance of the experiment. All unnecessary physical and mental suffering was to be avoided. A little-known fact is that the Nuremberg Code led to the notion of substituting animal experimentation in advance or in lieu of human experimentation. The Nuremberg Code further guaranteed that no experiments were to be permitted when death or disability was an expected outcome, except perhaps in those experiments where the experimental physicians also serve as subjects. Risks were to be commensurate with the importance of the problem, and human subjects were to be protected even from a remote possibility of harm. Experiments were to be conducted only by properly qualified scientists, and the subject had the right to stop the experiment at any time. Further, the scientist in charge was obligated to stop the experiment if injury, disability, or death was likely to result. The Declaration of Helsinki, an extension of the Nuremberg Code, was adopted in 1964 by the World Medical Association and amended and updated most recently in 2008. The Declaration of Helsinki expanded the principles of the Nuremberg Code to differentiate between therapeutic research and non-therapeutic research. Therapeutic research is expected to confer on the study subject an opportunity to receive a treatment that might be beneficial. Non-therapeutic research is carried out for the purpose of generating knowledge and is not expected to benefit the study subject, but might lead to improved treatment in the future. As a result of these violations of basic human rights, both international and national guidelines for the ethical treatment of research subjects were developed. National guidelines for the nurse researcher. In 1974, Congress passed the National Research Act, which resulted in the formation of the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. Members of the National Commission wrote the Ethical Principles and Guidelines for the Protection of Human Subjects of Research report, commonly known as the Belmont Report. So the Belmont Report was published in 1978 and has become the cornerstone statement of ethical principles on which regulations for the protection of human subjects are based. The Belmont Report scientific research has produced substantial social benefits. It also has posed some troubling ethical questions. Public attention was drawn to these questions by reported abuses of human subjects in biomedical experiments. As a result, state and national regulations, as well as international and professional codes, have been developed to guide researchers. These rules are based on broader ethical principles that provide a framework to evaluate investigators' judgment when designing and carrying out their research. 3 foundational ethical principles relevant to the ethics of human subjects are described in the Belmont Report: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. So before we continue, you might want to consider for future purposes which 2 international codes were developed to guide researchers in carrying out ethical research. Which 2 international codes were developed to guide researchers in carrying out ethical research. Respect for persons. Respect for persons, the first principle, incorporates 2 ethical convictions that individuals should be treated as autonomous beings capable of making their own decisions, and that the persons with diminished autonomy, or those not capable of making their own decisions, be protected. The extent of protection afforded to those incapable of self-determination will depend on the risks, harms, and benefits of the study. Consequently, the principle of respect for persons is divided into 2 separate moral requirements: the requirements to acknowledge a person's autonomy and the requirement to protect those individuals with diminished autonomy. Persons with diminished autonomy sometimes are regarded as vulnerable or as a member of a vulnerable population. These groups may contain some individuals who possesses limited autonomy, that is, they cannot fully participate in the consent process. For example, children, individuals with dementia and other cognitive disorders, prisoners, and pregnant women. Some ethicists regard older persons, terminally ill persons, and other hospitalized persons, as well as those who are homeless, students, or transgender, as deserving of special considerations by researchers. You may want to consider vulnerable populations in research for future quizzing purposes. This would definitely be something to home in on. So beneficence. Beneficence is one of the most fundamental ethical principles in research. That is, do no harm. According to the Belmont Report, persons are treated in an ethical manner not only by respecting their decisions and protecting them from harm, but also making efforts to secure their well-being. Two general rules have been formulated as complementary expressions of beneficent actions: do no harm and maximize possible benefits and minimize possible harms. The Belmont Report tells us that first, human subjects can be harmed in a variety of ways, including physical harm, injury, psychological harm, worry, stress, fear, social harm, loss of friends or one's place in society, and economic harm, loss of employment. Researchers must strive to minimize harm and to achieve the best possible balance between the benefits to be gained from participation and the risks of being a participant. This is when the Belmont Report tells us that the assessment of the risks and benefits of a study present an opportunity to gather comprehensive information about the proposed research. The investigator strives to design a study that will answer a meaningful question. A review committee will determine whether risks inherent in participation are justified. Prospective subjects will make an assessment, and based on their understanding of risks and benefits as to whether to participate in the study. Justice. The third broad principle found in the Belmont Report is justice. The principle of justice incorporates participants' right to fair treatment and fairness in distribution of benefit and burden. According to the report, an injustice would occur when a benefit to which a person is entitled is denied or when some burden is unduly imposed. For example, the selection of research subjects need to be closely scrutinized to determine whether some subjects are welfare patients, racial and ethical minorities, or persons confined to institutions are being systematically selected because of their easy accessibility or because of their compromised position. The application of justice also requires that research should not unduly involve persons from groups unlikely to be beneficiaries of the results of the research. However, members of diverse groups also should be included but not excluded without a prior knowledge of their suitability to participate. Certain diverse groups, such as minorities, the economically disadvantaged, the homeless, the very sick, and those persons who have a compromised ability to provide consent, should be protected against the danger of being recruited for a study solely for the researcher's convenience. In short, this means that researchers may not take advantage of underprivileged persons in order to benefit those who are privileged. The ethical nurse researcher considers all these principles as a research study is designed and carried out. The failure to identify and resolve ethical issues can place both the conduct and the results of the study in jeopardy. Keep in mind and consider the importance of justice. The ethical researcher. Bad behavior in the name of science has given rise in the need for laws, regulations, and safeguards. The public's perception of research, its benefits, and its risks is shaped by the way research is conducted and by the way the results are reported. Researchers then should abide by the ethical guidelines cited in the Nuremberg Code, the Belmont Report, and the Helsinki Declaration. Additionally, other guidelines have been developed that are specific to research funded by the federal government or foundations. These groups use guidelines to uphold the public's confidence in research and its contribution to knowledge for the greater good. These guidelines declare that the ethical researcher should honor the following criteria: adhere to the principles of beneficence by doing no harm, maximizing benefits, and minimizing possible harms. Respect the autonomy of participants in the consent process. Employ the principle of justice in subject selection. Explain the research procedures to the participants. obtain proper and informed consent, ensure the confidentiality of the participants, maintain appropriate documentation of the research process, adhere to research protocols, and report results in fair and factual manner. Informed consent. Informed consent encompasses much more than just a form or a signature. Rather, it is a process of information exchange that includes recruitment materials, verbal dialogue, presentation of written materials, questions and answers, and an agreement that is documented by signature. According to the Belmont report, the consent process contains 3 components: information, comprehension, and voluntariness. Participants should be able to ask questions, understand the risks and benefits, and be ensured if they choose to participate, they may withdraw at any time without consequences. Informed consent, a process of information exchange in which participants are provided with understandable information needed to make a participation decision, full disclosure of the risks and benefits, and the assurance that withdrawal is possible at any time without consequences. This process begins with recruitment and ends with a signed agreed document. To judge how much information should be disclosed to a prospective subject, the reasonable subject standard should be used. Excuse me. This standard requires that the extent and the nature of the information provided be sufficient for a reasonable person to decide whether to participate. Organization of the informed consent. Prospective subjects are fully informed about the nature of the research and its associated risks and benefits, are positioned to make an educated decision about whether to participate. Essential content for informed consent in research can be found in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Code of Federal Regulations. Deception or incomplete disclosure. When explaining the research procedures to the prospective subject, the researcher must explain all the information that is known about the risks and benefits. The subject needs to know if the treatment, drug, or procedure used in the study is not necessary for his or her care, and if it may have outcomes that are questionable or not completely understood. Full disclosure or reporting as much information as is known at the time is crucial so the participant can make an informed decision as to whether to participate. Some participants must not be informed of some aspects of the research because having such knowledge would likely impair the validity of the research. This threat to validity, called the Hawthorne effect, treatment effects or placebo effects, may lead subjects to behave differently simply because they are being treated. This outcome might happen in a study involving experimental drugs or complementary therapies. For example, balancing the expectation of participants for the care they will receive with the purpose of the research may be challenging. This issue is most often addressed by using vague rather than deceptive language. However, incomplete disclosure is generally allowable only when all of the following conditions are met. No other non-deceptive methods exist to the study or phenomenon of interest. The study will make substantial contribution to the body of knowledge. The deception is not expected to cause significant harm or emotional distress. Participants are debriefed about the deception as soon as possible. Comprehension. Because of a person's informed consent to participate is based on his or her understanding of the benefits and risks, in addition to the overall importance of the area under study, the researcher acts as a communicator and evaluator when ensuring that the prospective subject understands the intent of the study. When developing the informed consent form, the investigator may use institutional boilerplate templates to communicate all necessary information in an organized fashion. It is important to avoid the use of healthcare jargon and technical terms and to use simple language. For participants from a general population, for example, hospitalized patients, the wording of the consent form should be at the 7th or 8th grade level. Readability formulas, based on the length of sentences and the number of syllables per word, can be found in Microsoft Word. These formulas are based on the Flex Reading E-score, developed in the 1940s, and the Flesch-Kincaid grade level score developed for educational purposes in the 1970s. Research integrity. All types of research, but particularly research involving human subjects, should be conducted under strict ethical guidelines. Research integrity involves more than meeting basic ethical principles for the treatment of human subjects. The researcher's work must demonstrate integrity in all phases of the research process, from design to analysis through reporting and follow-up. A well-designed study may be ethical by plan, but manipulated during implementation. For this reason, most analysis decisions should be made a priori, meaning before data have been collected. Otherwise, it may be possible to manipulate the data to mislead the reader or to selectively report findings that are supportive of the reader's point of view. So this manipulation of data can be accomplished into statistical analysis by changing the significance level, or by making erroneous assumptions to make the results seem more conclusive. Data in graphs can be manipulated by changing the distance between the values on the axis to make the results appear more significant than they are. In these examples, the vertical axis and the legends on the charts have been altered to make it appear as if one's hospital is making more money when, in fact, the hospitals have identical revenue figures. Completing a training course in research protocol is one of the best ways to ensure that the research is conducted under the most ethical guidelines. The NIH requires ethics training for anyone involved with the NIH grants the NIH requires ethics training for anyone involved with NIH grants or anyone who conducts research in the NIH facilities. A few of the areas typically covered in this type of training include data acquisition and management, publication practices, research misconduct, and responsible authorship. Those new to research process should participate in some type of training on the responsible conduct of the research, whether or not the study is federally sponsored. Legal and regulatory guidelines for conducting research. Ethics and laws are intimately intertwined. In fact, they might be considered different points on the same continuum. Obeying the law, the minimum standard, is at one end of the continuum, and acting ethically above the expected minimum behavior is at the opposite end. The duality of the law and ethics also exists in research. The nurse researcher can think of the law as a minimum standard and ethics as a higher standard. Law can also be thought as a means of conflict resolution. Although most people do the right thing ethically, if they do not, the law is here to resolve the situation. The good researcher maximizes both the legal and ethical protections afforded to the subjects in the study. Brief overview of laws related to research. The four sources of law that may affect researchers are common law, administrative law, statutory law, and tort law. Common law is derived from judicial decisions made during a trial, case law, and often applies rules from early English common law. Medical malpractice lawsuits are an example of common law. Administrative law is formulated by federal and state governments and other regulatory agencies and obtains its authority from Congress. An example of administrative law is the Health Insurance Portability Accountability Act, HIPAA, which is a federal regulation governing the patient's right to privacy and confidentiality. Most laws that affect the clinical researcher are statutes or statutory laws. Statutory laws are enacted, amended, and repealed by the legislator. A fourth category of legal issues has its roots in tort law. Torts are civil wrongs committed against individuals or their property. Examples of tort law include negligence, malpractice, assault, battery, false imprisonment, invasion of privacy, and invoking mental or emotional distress. Although these last allegations are unlikely in a clinical research project, they can happen and may subsequently provoke a malpractice claim. Most claims are brought when a subject believes he or she has been harmed due to negligence on the part of the researcher. Examples of negligence in clinical research include using an instrument known to be defective, using equipment that is not functioning properly, denying a patient reasonable treatment so as to obtain a control group, or not following a specified research protocol so that the patient's safety is compromised. All these circumstances may cause injury to the participant and result in a claim of negligence. A researcher could be accused of defamation, a false or harmful oral statement, or libel, a false or harmful published statement, as a result of the way he or she presents information in both written account of the research. Truthful researchers need not fear either of these outcomes. Both require the intent to distribute information that is known to be correct. Reporting the truth is the best defense against accusations of defamation and libel. To further protect the legal rights of subjects, the researcher should guard against referring the individual's identity in any written research reports. The researcher must also guard against inflicting mental or emotional distress. In any research design that involves sensitive topics, the participant may experience painful emotions such as grief, despair, or shame. Most research protocols, therefore, include in the consent form statements such as potential emotional distress may occur as a result of this research, so the subject may make a fully informed decision about participation. The right of privacy is the right to be left alone. Patients and research participants have a right to the confidentiality of their health records and the release of that information only to those parties whom they have authorized. The right to privacy covers the right both to physical privacy of the person's body and to the privacy of one's health information. Privacy is also about human dignity and the privacy of one's own person. Accusations of invasions of privacy have been brought against personnel for uncovering patient bodies unnecessarily or performing examinations in front of others. This may be particularly problematic when the research protocol calls for multiple data collectors to check inter-rater reliability. Invasion of privacy may also involve the written word. Patients have the right to privacy of their health information throughout the research process. Whether they disclose such information verbally or it's retrieved from an electronic or written record. In the field of clinical research, breaches of this right invoke HIPAA sanctions. In cases of breaches of confidentiality or invasion of privacy, the patient or participant need not prove damages, making it easier for the subject or subject to initiate a lawsuit. To avoid accusations of discrimination in the population under study, researchers must be careful when choosing the populations to exclude from the research. Valid reasons to exclude a particular population, such as pregnant women, certain age groups, or certain diagnoses, must be specifically documented. These exclusion criteria are necessary for good design and to ensure the subjects are selected without bias. Proper selection of research population is a primary consideration when researchers are studying potentially life-threatening or life-saving treatments. The key to avoiding any of these accusations is the accurate documentation of all research steps, in addition to following the ethical principles discussed earlier in this chapter. Following these guidelines will minimize the threat of any legal action and by any research participant and reassure the researcher that he or she is doing the right thing. Legal issues surrounding informed consent. So, signing a consent form to participate in research carries the same purpose and values as does signing the consent form for treatment in healthcare facilities. Requirements governing what should be included on an informed consent form are the same for legal purposes for ethical purposes. However, legal issues have been raised about who can provide consent for participating in a research study. If the individual cannot legally consent to participating in research, for example, if the individual is a minor, has been judged incompetent, or is a member of a vulnerable population, the researcher must ensure that the person's interests are protected. Consents must be obtained from the subject, if possible, as well as from the legal guardian. In some cases, formal consent is obtained from the legal guardian and simultaneously assent is provided by the participant. For example, a child should agree that he or she is willing to participate in a study, assent, even though the legal consent is required from the parents. If the research involves human subject participation, in addition to consent, the researcher should obtain an authorization that allows the researcher access to the participant's medical information. This authorization for access to medical information may be incorporated into the consent form. Table 3.4 provides an example of an authorization for release of information. Research that involves human subjects in some way, as opposed to retrieving data from records or databases, requires a higher level of oversight. This oversight is provided by legal entities that also are charged with maintaining ethical standards in research. These entities, called IRBs, institutional review boards, are required by law in any organization that allows conduct of research involving people. You will meet the IRB board for everybody that's going for their doctoral because your dissertation has to go through an IRB. Institutional review boards. The National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research was established in 1974. This commission advised the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services on policies related to research. The Commission was instrumental in the adoption of the recommendations of the Belmont Report of 1978. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services then developed new regulations governing research and human subjects of research under the Code of Federal Regulations, the CFR. These new regulations call for the creation of institutional review boards, IRB, also known as human subject committees, as safeguards against the inhumane treatment of individuals that had, in the past, been inflicted in the name of science. Part 46 of CFR 45 requires that any research conducted on human subjects be approved by an IRB. According to the requirements in Part 46, the mission of the IRB is to ensure that research is ethically acceptable and that the welfare of rights of research participants are protected. The review process. Research studies that involve human subjects must be reviewed by the IRB. The IRB helps the researcher determine whether there is a potential for a legal or ethical breach that ensures that and safeguards are in place to avoid risk. There are 3 categories for research review by an IRB: exempt review, expedited review, and full review. An exempt review covers proposals that do not require review by the IRB. The IRB determines whether a study is exempt, and this is not the researcher's decision. This category is limited to studies that pose no risk for the subjects, such as the designation is common when the researcher employs surveys, non-invasive procedures, secondary data or documents, and other methods where it would be impossible to identify any research subject individually. The exemption only refers to the fact that the IRB does not need to review the study proposal. It does not exempt the researcher from the same ethical principles that govern all research. Exempt review. A review of study proposals that pose no risk to subjects. The full IRB is not required to participate. Expedited review. A review of study proposals that pose minimal risk to subjects. 1 or 2 IRB members participate. Full review. A review of study proposals that pose more than minimal risk to subjects that do not qualify for exempt status and in which the full IRB committee participates. Research misconduct. Obtaining the necessary approvals for the IRB and privacy committee does not guarantee that the research is then free from accusations of battery, negligence, or invasion of privacy. It is up to the researcher to carry out the research in an ethical, legal, and moral manner, and to document the procedures and results accurately. Sorry, Siri picked that up. The HIPAA privacy rule. What I may see or hear in the course of the treatment, or even outside of the treatment in regard to the life of man, which on no account one must spread abroad, I will keep to myself, holding such things shameful to be spoken about. Since April 14th, 2003, the effective date of the U.S. privacy rule, otherwise known as HIPAA, organizations have been more tightly scrutinized research proposals, especially those that involve the use of patient data and human subjects. Reacting to the increasing accessibility to electronic data viable about the individual, Congress passed the HIPAA Act in 1996, aimed mostly at the electronic health record, EHR initiatives. One of HIPAA's main elements is a requirement for the protection of personal health information. The rule protects all elements considered protected health information, a broad range of information that varies from telephone numbers to diagnoses. Table 3.5 lists information that is considered identifiable personal health information, PHI. The introduction of HIPAA's privacy rule resulted in changes from the way hospitals had traditionally handled patients and their information. Healthcare workers are now given access to only the PHI that is necessary to perform the assigned work at hand. For example, those personnel working in ancillary departments receive only a diagnosis that enables them to process the tests or bills. Therefore, the researcher cannot automatically assume that the access to all information required to complete research will be provided, even if the researcher is employed by the facility. Recent revisions to the privacy rule, Public Law 111-5, American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, strengthened and revised the initial law. The newest version of regulation implies that an organization must be able to account for all uses of PHI, even internal uses. Researchers may be required to include contact information and notices in patient records when data has been collected from them. Researchers could be held liable for any breaches of PHI data that occur as a result of data collection or analysis. In turn, researchers must not assume that simply because they work in a healthcare facility, they will have ready access to the facility's patients' databases, or diagnostic information, or even limited data sets. The provisions of the privacy rule provide additional safeguards for the participants, which can make it difficult, though not impossible, to do research in healthcare facilities. The researcher should plan well in advance of the start of the study as to whether access to certain data elements and health information can be obtained and how. If the researcher requires access to medical records of the patient or participant, consent forms should be obtained authorizing the researcher to access the information. The research consent should include an authorization for access to records. If it is not included, the researcher must document how access to the information will be obtained. Retrospective studies that involve the use of patient data from electronic sources or medical records may require the researcher to supply a disclosure statement to document access. Alternatively, the IRB may grant a waiver that exempts the researcher from obtaining authorization, although disclosure statements may still be required. Reading research for evidence-based practice. Most studies will not explicitly describe the ethical or legal issues they faced unless they were unusual or difficult to resolve. This is not a weakness, but rather reflects the reality that ethical and legal compliance are given when planning any research study. Ethical and regulatory guidelines are not negotiable, so it may be simply stated that the study underwent IRB review. If so, then it's safe to assume the study was reviewed by an objective panel and met basic ethical and legal requirements. Using research in nursing practice. The nurse should be hesitant to use the results of research in practice if he or she suspects the study was conducted unethically or in some way breached the legal protections of subjects. The nurse should be aware that research misconduct can occur and that studies that are a result of such misconduct cannot be trusted. Ethical and legal constraints also help ensure research quality and validity of findings. Research that was generated through deception or duress will likely not represent the populations well. In other words, If the researcher cannot be trusted, then the research findings cannot be trusted either. Creating evidence for practice. The nurse researcher can best deal with the potential ethical and legal issues in a research study by focusing on strong designs that answer the research question with a minimum of disruption in subjects' lives. If the nurse researcher focuses on doing the right thing, it is rare that an ethical or legal issue will arise. The researcher must keep in mind, however, that compliance with ethical and regulatory issues is not confined to the design period. Some problems may arise during the implementation of a research study. The principle that guides the legal and ethical treatments of subjects, whether in preparation for an IRB review or for actual data collection, are ongoing throughout the study. Inadvertent problems and unforeseen issues may happen during research. The careful researcher considers these fundamental guidelines as a basis for decisions about the entire research project process, not just the IRB application. That concludes week 2 lecture for nursing research. I am your professor, Dr. Marion Johnson. You can text me, call me, email, any questions. Please do look out for a few major key points. We do have a quick quiz coming up at the end of week 2. Thank you for your participation, and I will see you all in week 3. Enjoy.